Well, good evening, friends and neighbors and lovers of classical music. It's great to see people piling on to the comments section. Nice to know you're all here. I see lots of familiar names. I'm Greg Youtz. I'll be your host this evening. I'm a music professor and composer at Pacific Lutheran University, and it is frequently my honor to be asked to do pre-concert events for Symphony Tacoma, as well as, during this very unusual pandemic year, a number of online events. Let me just, this is called From the Back Row, essentially an introduction to Symphony Tacoma's low brass section. And let me take a moment at the very beginning here to just thank the sponsors that make events like this possible. The sponsors for tonight's broadcast are Multicare, Tacoma Creates, the Washington State Arts Commission, Saturna Capital, and Titus Will. Thank you very much to all those sponsors. We literally could not do this without you. So, from the back row, the low brass section of Symphony Tacoma, please welcome tonight's guests, Keith Winkle, Grant Reed, Ben Hansen, and Paul Evans. Welcome, gentlemen. Nice to see your faces.
Thanks, Greg.
Hello.
Thank you.
Well, of course, our audience knows you all as back row people. You're back there, often from the audience's point of view, back row towards the right, I would say, from the audience right. Occasionally, the horns are up there on the back row with you on the left, and sometimes they're kind of off by themselves. Is that because they didn't shower, or because you people have been bickering and Sarah had to separate you? Tell us a little bit about your placement on the stage.
Sure, I'll answer the horn question. Actually, the horns moved over. You know, one of the problems with the Pantages stage for a full symphony orchestra is it's plenty deep, but it's very narrow. And so in the orchestra, the entire time I've been in the orchestra, it's always been tough to find out where to put the brass along the back row. And Sarah ended up moving them off to the left in their own little area in front of the percussion, and then just left the trombones, tuba, trumpets in the back, and that seems to have worked out pretty well.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you, Paul. Let's just chat a little bit about each one of you as musicians. Keith, you're the principal trombonist. Let me start with you. Tell us just a little bit about how you chose trombone as a kid, where you went to school, and maybe some other things about the rest of your life when you're not on Symphony Tacoma's stage.
Okay, well, I'm going to start off by just if I can't, nothing on my screen is moving. So if you can't hear me, you can move on to the next person, and I will try to refresh my screen.
We hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Well, I grew up in Yakima, Washington, in a musical family. My dad was a high school band director, and my mom teaches piano lessons. And in fact, she still teaches piano lessons in Yakima. And so that's kind of where I got my whole music background, was from them. When I was a kid, I used to hang around in my dad's band room and try out different instruments. And that's probably how I ended up as being a trombone player. He himself was a trombone player, but funny enough, I don't think I ever heard him play trombone, not even once. Maybe that's a little strange. I guess he had just stopped playing by then. Yeah. But I went through high school playing trombone, and when I went to Central Washington University, when it came time to go to college, because it was close by, and they had a great trombone teacher and wind ensemble director, Larry Gukin. He was probably one of the best things about Central for me was being there with him and studying trombone with him and learning about the way he approached music so intensely, getting all the details right. That was really left a big impression on me. And then I went to University of North Texas to get a master's because I had gotten a music ed degree, but I didn't really feel like I was ready to jump into that yet. So I looked around, and I ended up going to get a master's in trombone performance. And when I came back to Seattle in about 1999, I first played with, back then it was called Tacoma Symphony. So that was a little bit more than 20 years ago. And I started there as a substitute and would fill in every now and then. And eventually, as spots opened up, I got a second trombone spot, and then the first trombone spot. And then, and so I've just been working in the Puget Sound area ever since, and loving it up until 1 year ago when, okay, well, that's probably all you want to hear about me. So how about the next person?
All right, very good. Thank you, Keith. Grant, moving on down the trombone line, tell us a little bit about how you started playing.
Sure. I started playing when I was in 4th grade, and both of my parents are musicians, so that was probably some inspiration to start doing music. And my father played trombone, so I thought I'd pick that too. Why not? And then I didn't want to take it too seriously, but my mother insisted on me getting private lessons. A local trombonist and teacher in the Puget Sound region. His name is Stan Jeffs, who I think has played with Symphony Tacoma before, maybe several years ago. And so I studied with him, and then I also went on to study with David Ritt from the Seattle Symphony when I was in high school. And I thought, maybe I can make a living out of doing this. And then I went to the Eastman School of Music in upstate New York for my undergrad studies. And after there, I proceeded on to Northwestern University, where I got my master's in trombone performance. And after that, I moved back to the Seattle area because, it's where I'm from, and won a spot with the Symphony Tacoma. And I've just been working on freelancing and teaching ever since, up until about a year ago. I've still been teaching online through the pandemic, but no performing.
Yeah. And do I recall, Grant, somewhere I read that you are an alum of the Seattle Youth Symphony?
That's right. I totally forgot about that, but I was a part of that organization all through middle and high school.
Yeah. So Keith came out of the band world, and Grant came out maybe of both, but also out of the orchestra world.
Right.
Yeah. Great.
Mostly orchestra for me.
All right. Ben Hansen, you have a larger trombone. Moving on down the bench, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I started on the American baritone back in 5th grade, and sometime in the late 80s, I think it was 87, and progressed to pick up trombone about 1990 just because of the fact that euphoniums and American baritones don't play that often unless you play in bands, which are pretty much only in schools or an occasional brass band outside. Trombones, however, play in lots of things. So I picked up trombone, and then shortly thereafter picked up the bass trombone in 91 or something like that. And that's what I've been playing since. I have an undergrad degree in trombone performance from CWU, just like Keith, quite a bit later though. And I also repair musical instruments for a living, so I don't gig entirely. I do not teach at all. I play my instruments, and I studied some early music with various people, which I'll talk about in the history of the trombone segment I'm doing. And that's about it. My last gig was just over a year ago too. So I have been practicing here or there, but I've been very busy this last year, unlike some people. So I can't wait till we start playing again.
Indeed. Okay, we already have a question in the chat about the very tall trombone next to you, but I know that you're going to talk about that a bit later. So
We will.
We'll keep that question open for a little bit. And finally, Paul Evans, not a trombonist at all, a tuba player. Tell us a little bit about how you fell into the world of the tuba.
Yeah. I started playing trumpet in 4th grade, and I was a lousy trumpet player. And so my band director was trying to find something else for me, and I found there was a French horn in the band room. I thought that was really neat. And I think my band director must have decided I probably was, if I couldn't play the trumpet, I wasn't going to be fit for the French horn either. So he found a euphonium and said, "Why don't you try this?" And so I played euphonium all the way through through most of my junior high, and started playing tuba in 9th grade, and kind of started to take off. It was just, I don't know if it fit my face or fit my personality or what, but all of a sudden when I started playing tuba, life got a lot easier musically for me. So, and I played all through high school. I played in the Tacoma Youth Symphony, and I ended up going to school at BYU. And then I ended up transferring to the University of Utah to study with the tuba player in the Utah Symphony, where I really started learning orchestral. Like I say, I'd never really studied orchestral music until I started studying with Gary Offenloch at the University of Utah.
Yeah.
I won a position with the Boise Philharmonic before I finished there. So I ended up transferring as well to Boise State University, where I was finishing up my bachelor's degree and teaching tuba at the same time, and playing in the symphony there. And in the year 2000, I believe it was, I won an audition with the Tacoma Symphony at the time.
Yeah.
And I've been here ever since.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm a fellow alum of the Tacoma Youth Symphony as well. So great and powerful organization. It's affected literally thousands of kids. All right. Well, that's who the low brass section is. I'm going to ask Grant to take us on a little tour of for the trombone, basically, with regards to how the low brass produce sound. Now, some of our audience were with us in January. We did a program with the horn section called That's a Wrap. And we talked with them a little bit about things like fundamentals and overtones. But you, of course, have a slide. So, Grant, go ahead and talk to us a little bit about lip buzzing, mouthpieces, slides, conical bores, that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, if you heard the French horn interview, then maybe some of this will be a repetition, but I might as well just start from the beginning. Basically, all brass instruments, in order to produce a sound on them, you buzz your lips together like this. You blow air, and it catches on the lips and causes them to vibrate. And you do that into this thing called the mouthpiece, which all brass instruments have. And then if you put that into the instrument, basically what's happening is that lip buzzing is being amplified through the instrument. It goes all the way through the tubing and comes out the bell at the end. So basically, the instrument is just an amplifier for your lips vibrating. And then in order to play different pitches on all brass instruments, in their open position, or for trombones with the slide all the way in, called first position, you have a fundamental pitch, which for the tenor trombone, which I have here, is a low B flat. The instrument is pitched in B flat. And then you can play maybe a dozen or so notes in the Overtone series above that B flat by contracting your lips and puckering up your lips tighter and tighter to go higher and higher. And so on and so forth. You can go pretty high there, but I'm not going to hurt myself right now. And then, so you can play a dozen or so notes all in just one position on the trombone, or on the tuba, just with no valves pushed down. And unlike most other brass instruments, which have those valves, which I just mentioned, to change the length of the tubing that the air is traveling through, trombone has this slide, which everybody is familiar with, and moving the slide out, of course, increases the total amount of tubing that the air is traveling through. So that lowers the pitch. And then on the trombone, there are seven slide positions that you can play in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can't really see it, but trust me, there's a 7th one out there. And then in each of those, there's, like I said, a dozen or so notes, and that makes up, our entire chromatic range on the instrument. So there was Overtone Series, and so I mentioned that the slide, of course, when we move it outward, it increases the total length of tubing of the instrument. And it's the same way on valves that on a tuba or a trumpet or a French horn. When you push down those buttons, like I said, it increases the total amount of tubing that the air is traveling through, which lowers the pitch. Maybe Paul wants to talk about how those valves work. Let me give us a demonstration of how the valves on a tuba work.
Yeah, I happen to have a tuba right here. I'm going to try, and I was asked to, so I'm going to just move this down here so you can see my lips, hopefully, and you can see my fingers on the valves. So it's kind of hard to see here, but this tuba actually has 5 valves. There's 4 piston type valves. With my first 4 fingers, I just put 1 on each of them and go. And then there's also this right here is a rotary valve. You can see here it's got a lever right here, so I can operate that 5th rotary valve. And like Grant was saying, all these valves do is when I'm open, the air does not vibrate through any of the valve tubing at all. It just goes through the open bugle of the instrument and out the bell. So that's when it's open, the instrument is the shortest it's going to be. Then when I want to play a different set of notes, because like Grant was saying, you only have access to about 12 notes is being generous. I don't know that I can play 12 notes, but probably can. But anyway, you want to play more notes. And so I push down a valve. And when I push down this valve, then it's a little hard to show right here. It's a little easier to see with this first valve that there's this set of tubing right here. This tube right here is now in play. And so it actually adds a whole step to the instrument. So instead, this is a C tuba. So when there are no valves being used at all, it's in the key of C. When I push this valve down, it's in the key of B flat and becomes a B flat tuba. And so it's just that much longer. This second valve you can't see it. It's hard to show it here. There's actually, I don't know if you can see this thing. I can actually manipulate the slide with this little pull here. But it's a much shorter slide. It's a half-step slide. And so this actually puts the instrument in the key of B. At any rate, this allows me to play through chromatically, just by pushing down different combinations of valves. So, and the more valves you have, the easier it is to play things in tune, in particular in the low register. On a C tuba, there's some notes that get played relatively frequently that are hard to play in tune with only a 4-valve instrument. So most professional C tubas will have 5 valves. And there was a question I saw about sometimes playing on a smaller tuba. That's a good question. So this is officially called a contrabass tuba. And I happen to have a bass tuba. Pardon me, I know I'm getting soft. It's in the key of C. And behind me here, if I can find it. Behind me here, I have a much smaller, it may not appear smaller, but a much smaller tuba that's in the key of E flat. Has a different sound. And I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about why I have 2 different tubas and why I play 2 different tubas later. One of the other things that you'll notice is if you were to follow the tubing, I hope you can hear me okay. If you were to follow the tubing from where my mouthpiece goes into the receiver, and I've got this lead pipe, they call it, it goes into directly into the valve section. And if you were to follow this all the way around the bugle and leave the slides that are associated with valves out of it for now, and just follow it around and around and around, you'll notice that it gets the further away from the mouthpiece that the tubing gets, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what's known as a conical bore instrument. It gradually gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the way throughout the entire bugle of the instrument until you get to the bell flare. And that's very different from a trumpet or a trombone which for the most part stays very close to the same size all the way through the bugle of the instrument until you get out to the bell flare where it starts to flare out. And the effect of that is that even though a tuba is very big, it's a very mellow sounding instrument. There are such a thing as an instrument in the same pitch as a tuba, the same range as a tuba, that is a cylindrical bore instrument, and they sound like a gigantic trombone, like a contrabass trombone. So they have a different use, but tubas are very mellow sounding instruments because of that graduated bore.
Yeah.
Or graduated, tubing.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you for bringing up the conical versus cylindrical bore. I mean, this is something that I talk about all the time with my composition students, because the effect of a trombone playing, let's say, a B flat 2 octaves below middle C versus a bass trombone playing that same note. I mean, the pitch is the same, but the timbre is so different, so you really want to choose your instrument very carefully. I see another a good question. This is probably prompted by both Grant and Paul's discussions. Is it possible to play the same pitch using different positions or valves?
Absolutely. There's, just like on, I'm sure there's equivalents on tuba, but you can play a note on trombone like a B flat. And that's where we normally play our middle B flat at the top of the bass clef staff. And it feels good to play it there because we're in B flat when we're in first position. Yeah. But you can also use alternate fingerings called alternate slide positions and play the same note. I can play it in sharp fifth position. So there are alternate fingerings or slide positions for both trombone and tuba. And we don't usually use those unless it maybe will help facilitate a technical passage or to, something like some fast playing, or if we want to play something smoother. If I use that B flat in fifth instead of going all the way into first, then that makes that legato passage a lot easier because we're not moving the slide back and forth so much.
Right, and that, the difference between the trombone and tuba in that case is we use a lot on tuba in particular. It's because it's so low and because all the notes are so far apart. Intonation on tubas can be very wonky, troublesome at times, and so we use alternate fingerings for intonation purposes all the time on tuba. Great.
Ben, go ahead and show us your trombone, the bass trombone, and I don't know, is there something you want to, just talk to us about the difference between a tenor trombone and a bass trombone.
The differences are primarily on modern instruments. It's the amount of conicity and the beginning starting bore. In the old times, this instrument would be considered an overgrown tenor trombone. As you see the tall trombone behind me, which I'll talk about in the history segment here, this is pitched in the same length of tubing as Paul's small tuba. And it's very cylindrical, and this is a copy of an instrument from the 1630s. So with a handle on the slide. So on modern instruments, back about in the 1840s, they applied the new technology of valves to the trombone and came up what they called the tenor bass at that point in Germany. And that added a facility. First, it was just one valve, and it gave the facility in the range of a bass trombone and F to a B-flat instrument. B-flat instruments with a valve are very much more agile than the old bass trombone systems like the one behind me. This one happens to have two, which is the standard of orchestral bass trombones these days. There are bass trombones that only have one valve. They're not very popular, not terribly useful in modern playing as a singular instrument. But the primary thing that makes them a bass trombone is the size of the taper, which is much larger than a tenor trombone and gives a much broader sound. So in this instrument, this so you may be able to hear the timbre is quite a bit different than Grant's instrument, even with these not so great mics.
So Ben, does that mean that your bass trombone is a kind of a halfway between the brightness of the tenor trombone and the mellowness of the tuba?
It is actually used that way in a lot of orchestral writing. Not so much in bands as much, because they had brighter bass trombone sounds originally, or third trombones, as they weren't always bass trombones in various bands. But in a lot of orchestral writing, it is the glue between the conical tuba sound and the trombones. But that goes into a little bit of history. The long bass trombones, they're trying to mimic the sound of a German F bass trombone when they built the B-flat American ones, when they started doing that in the early 19th century, because these instruments don't sound like the ones from the 19th century at all. And that's part of my history spiel, which I don't know if I can get into right now or not. But,
let me go back to Grant just briefly, and let's talk about the whole issue of mutes. Because the other amazing thing about the brass family is you can get them to sound like completely different animals by plugging mutes into the bell. So let's just chat about that before we drop back into history with Ben.
Sure. So, actually, let me put this down. So trombones and trumpets have a whole multitude of different kinds of things that they can put into the bell section, which is called a mute. Here's just your typical straight mute, which is just the most common kind, and it alters the timbre of the instrument. Here's an example of a muted trombone with the straight mute, our most common one. So that changes the timbre and it makes it a little bit more little narrow and nasally. But there's also several other different kinds of mutes that you can put into the bell. There's one called the Cut Mute. There's our Harmon Mute, or the wah-wah mute, because you can, while you're playing, you put your hand in front of it and make the wah-wah sound. And there's a bucket mute, which is a big old thing, which somehow hangs onto my bell. And then there's the famous plunger mute, which is literally the end of a plunger. And that also makes kind of a wah-wah sound. So there's all kinds of these fun mutes that we use from time to time to change the timbre and find interesting new sounds for our instruments. Here's a practice mute, which ideally makes the instrument as silent as possible. So if you're traveling and you don't want to practice in a hotel room. I don't know if anybody heard that. But tubas, maybe we could go over to Paul now. Tubas also use mutes. They don't really have as many different kinds as are available for the trumpet or trombone, but they do use mutes on occasion, and it's quite an occasion when they do use them, because they're a big thing, and it's always noticeable when a tubist puts in their mute. And Paul can show you all.
Speaking of mutes, sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, most tuba players can't stand mutes because they're unwieldy. They draw unnecessary attention to the tuba player, because it's just kind of a funny thing to see this gigantic thing suddenly get lifted up above the orchestra and into a tuba bell. But it does the exact same thing as a trombone mute does. It changes the timbre, makes it softer, certainly, hence the mute sound. But I don't think for the most part the composers use the mute because they want the brass to play softer. If they just want the brass to play softer, they ask the brass to play softer. So really, the mute is more for a timbre change. It really changes the sound of the instrument. This happens to be a tuba cut mute, which is a relatively rare thing. The nice thing about this mute is it's kind of a dual purpose mute, because this collar comes off And when the collar isn't on there, it's just a normal straight mute. So anyway, that's the tuba mute.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, we're going to turn it over to Ben to sort of walk us through the centuries of the development of trombone and the tuba. And Ben, I can see some interesting questions coming up, like, could you talk about Mozart's use of the trombone? So
that's in my notes, actually, so I will go over that.
Excellent. So we'll turn it over. Very good. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, the trombone, the English name that we have right now is trombone. It's actually Italian, and it means large trumpet, great trumpet. And originally, these were all just the trombone was developed out of a 15th century instrument called the slide trumpet, which actually held the body of the instrument and held the mouthpiece, and then the mouthpiece and a pipe slid out like this. It was very unergonomic and difficult to play well. And then sometime around 1485 is when there's the first pictorial evidence in pictures of what we call a trombone these days. The original names were always trombone in Italian, but in English it was sackbut or shagbolt or all these various spellings, and that was entirely due to mistranslating the French word saccabuche, saccabut, and then the Spanish name was saccabuche, both which have Latin derivatives of push or pull. So it was talking about the slide action. And then in German, it was called very early on the boson, and then later on the passon. And in fact, in the German Bibles, they don't have the walls of Jericho being blown down by trumpets. They actually have them being blown down by trombones. They use the word boson in there. So the interesting thing about it is that these instruments, when they first got started in the 16th century, when they became very popular, there's instruments found throughout Europe, not a whole lot of them, but they were all over the place, were both used in liturgical music, mostly church music. And these ancient tiny trombones, which can only, the decibel output of these instruments is less than half of a modern orchestral instrument, maybe even a third. It's very small bore. They're much harder to play. They take a lot less wind, respectively. And they make a very compact, clear, vocal-like sound when played correctly and will not cover up a small choir, which is primarily what they were used for. They did play Renaissance dance music in the 16th century, but then as we got into the 17th century, there became a really golden age of trombone playing in the first half of the 17th century, where the trombones were being used in operas by Monteverdi and also some other liturgical use. But composers like Weckmann and other people were treating the tenor trombone in particular as an equal to violins. So there are some incredibly difficult, very soloistic, very difficult pieces of music from the first part of the 17th century and the very early Baroque. And then as the Baroque moved on, this very soloistic music became less and less until about 1700, where it kind of died off. But to give you an idea, this instrument is a copy of one from 1637, and the timbre is very much different. Give me a second to blow a note or two here. Very thin, kind of fuzzy. That's actually supposed to be the way it sounds. It could be played a little better if I was more warmed up. The same thing on a modern full-size American bass trombone. And that's the more conical sound that you would expect to blend between the modern orchestral tuba and the rest of the orchestral trombones. Now, where it went from there is, let me look at my notes here. We had the excellent chorale pieces and obligato trombone parts in the early Baroque between 1650 and 1700. And then after 1700 to 1800, the slide trombone almost died. There were a few little places it kept on going, but the amount of literature, besides just accompanying a few choral parts in Bach and things like that, there was almost no trombone literature in the 18th century. There was one place in the latter part of the 18th century in Vienna that wrote a bunch of pieces for alto trombone because they had a soloist there that could do it. But there was not much trombone writing except for a very limited amount of chorale usage. And that takes us to Mozart. Gluck and Mozart incorporated trombones into their operas, and the famous opera that has it is Don Giovanni, and actually the Magic Flute has some trombone too. But they were used in Don Giovanni. It was used as a scary ghost chorale when that's what the trombones were used for. The entirety was just one chorale in Don Giovanni. But Mozart used trombones in some of his choral masses and the Requiem. And at this point, they're not too much different than this 1637 trombone. They were very small. They didn't have bell flares. They had a funnel bell flare, and they had made a very quiet sound. And it wasn't until around 1800 that they really started getting larger, having bigger bell flares, and sounding a little bit more toward what you hear today. But that's when they started becoming used in symphonies by people like Beethoven. So Beethoven 5 has some famous trombone parts and some very wickedly high parts in the principal trombone, in the alto trombone part. Also, Schubert and Mendelssohn continued on with using very clear octave parts with trombones, and they were not written for a lot. Talking about counting measures in orchestral music, the amounts of measures in some of these early symphonies where they actually just tell you to forget about the first three movements and then count hundreds of measures until your entrance is quite interesting. So that's the life of playing early Romantic trombone literature in orchestras. From there, right about 1840 is when trombones got a redesign in Germany, became louder, and the orchestras became bigger, and they got to play a whole lot more from then on. So, by the 1870s, we're talking about Wagner ring cycles, everything that you would expect to hear, big, broad, beautiful trombone works that for instruments that were louder and more capable than the time beforehand. And then by the time you hit 1900, trombones are ubiquitous everywhere. In the 19th century, a lot of bands did not have trombones. They were all conical instruments of the sax horn designs. So the trombones were used in military bands in the early 19th century. But then by the time you get to the late 19th century, they started being made and used in American bands and elsewhere as well. So by 1900, they're everywhere. Trombones are everywhere. They're still not quite like what you'd see in Symphony Tacoma. But then the first quarter of the 20th century is when we got into a lot of writing in symphonic usage, in big band usage, and essentially the jazz era, to the point where there was, well, like I said, it's ubiquitous, but we also got into modern writing. And by 1950 or so, all the size instruments that we use now are common. So what you heard Bernstein write is very similar to what you would hear us perform. And that's pretty much it. We had a lot more avant-garde literature. The very first trombone concerto I can think of was written only in the 1840s or 50s, an actual concertino. There was some stuff written in the 17th century, but it was all obligato bass parts, and you could play it on trombone, but it wasn't specified for it. And then I think the golden age of modern trombone solo literature is probably from the 1960s and on. I think Keith might have something to say about that, but most of the literature that you see for solo trombone, and particularly for solo bass trombone, is fairly modern by standards.
Yeah.
So Let's see. Anything else in the notes that I missed?
Hmm.
You talk
And
about Mozart's use.
couple of questions for you from the comments. Some people
Mhm.
have noticed both the mysterious instrument behind your left shoulder and also the apparently tiny trombone on the shelf.
There's two tiny trombones on the shelf. There's an alto and then there is a soprano. They're not anything I make any money playing anywhere. They're especially the soprano is kind of a joke instrument. You see,
Here's an
Grant.
up close of the alto. Maybe we can talk about how, you know, it used to be an alto, tenor, and a bass trombone instead of two tenors and a bass. Ben, maybe you want to elaborate.
Yeah.
Well, I know on how it started off with an alto, tenor, and a bass to imitate the alto, tenor, and bass voices in the choir.
Yeah. That's actually the part with the Mozart where the trombones were mimicking the voices in the chorales. This is a bass instrument. It is longer. It does not have valves. It's the same length as Paul's tuba. So the low notes are. So this one's an E flat, but the rest of the trombone section. In modern pitches were E flat, B flat, sometimes F, sometimes E flat on the low ends. But before you had valves, you had to make the instrument physically longer to make the lower notes. And as I was saying, the accompanying the chorales and the Sackbut literature, they would have used three different sizes in most of the cases. But by Mozart's time, there were often just three B flat tenors playing the parts. And definitely with Beethoven's time, most of the time he was writing for three tenors, as the records suggest. And there was, of course, alto trombones, and there were, of course, bass trombones, but that was pretty much the typical thing. And Mozart's writing didn't actually have a long bass written, so this type of instrument isn't necessary to play as music. But Mozart's chorales did have low notes, and so did the Haydn's Creation, which has a famous bass trombone solo in it. So
it's fascinating, this idea of the trombone as associated with the divine or the diabolical, right? I mean, sort of something that is
ominous,
unearthly.
And speaking of ominous, one of the earliest specified uses of trombone, like it actually was in print that way, was Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. It specified trombones when the god of the underworld was talking to L'Orfeo. So there was a very dark, and a regal too. So there was, which is a reed organ. So there was a very mysterious, buzzy, dark chorale sound underneath a bass singer giving out bad news to L'Orfeo. So. Yeah, ominous or heavenly. And Berlioz said something about how trombones were heavenly, but that's a digression here. So, yes, there is a consort. The soprano is kind of a joke instrument. It's the range of a trumpet, and it's. I'm not going to try and play it because it will sound awful. You have to really work on that instrument. So,
Great.
Let's see. I think that's pretty much it for the history of trombone. You know, the big band era did provide a lot of great trombone music to play, but they were mostly playing small bore tenors and big bands and things like that. Bass trombone got added into the big bands only in the late 50s. And then it was given obligato parts with people like George Roberts and the like, who popularized the instrument.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Ben. Let me use a question from the chat to segue back over to Paul briefly and the world of valves. And we had a question about from Doug Mackey. When valves came into being, did their use apply to all instruments immediately, or did their use evolve? And I think that's a good way to get into the tuba and when it emerged and became sort of its orchestral identity. You're muted, Paul.
All right. I'm unmuted now. The tuba is kind of has a little bit of an interesting. The tuba is a very late addition to the orchestra, and it's the newest. I believe it's the newest instrument in the orchestra at all, as far as it's coming into being. The first tuba didn't come around until around the 1840s, and the trombone, like Ben said, has been around since the 15th century. Well, in one form or another, and so there were some earlier precursor. A lot of composers wanted there to be a bass brass voice, but like Ben said, without the addition of a valve, it became very unwieldy to build an instrument big enough to play those really low notes. And so the contrabass sack butts, the contrabass trombones were around, and then, like, if you saw Ben's instrument, it actually has a lever that attaches to the slide, so you can get out to those positions way out there. So not only is the instrument big, but you need a little bit of room around you to be able to play the thing. The earliest bass brass instrument was actually, that I know of, actually wasn't made out of brass at all. It was made out of wood, and it's called the serpent. And it's kind of an interesting. Basically, it was a serpent because it looked like a snake. It curved around like this. It did have a little bit of a conical bore, but it was a very small instrument that just had either, in some cases, some tone holes. So they carved it out of wood in two halves, and then they wrapped it together with leather, and it would have a brass mouthpiece on it, and then they would drill holes at the right place. So it was almost like you're playing a flute, right? And I do believe that they might have added keys, a couple of keys to some of them to get some of the notes. But you can still see them. You can check out. You go Google a serpent, musical instrument serpent, and you'll see pictures of them. They're really horrible instruments. There's a group of people that really enjoy them, but it's kind of like, it's enjoying the uncle that maybe nobody else wants to be around. They don't project at all. They kind of sound like they have a cold. They're very nasally. And they weren't made out of brass either, so they didn't have good projection. So the next instrument that came along was much better, and it was made out of brass. It was a keyed instrument, like a great big saxophone, but it looked more like I would say like a brass bassoon, only that the bore was bigger and it opened up big at the end, like this, but it was shaped more like a bassoon. It had a brass mouthpiece and keys, and it was called the Ophicleide. And you can still purchase Ophicleides today. They get used in period music quite frequently. Not here. I don't own one. I don't play one. They sound much better than a serpent, but they don't sound great either. Intonation is a little tricky on those things, and they have a very small, very nasally sound. And so, again, you notice I'm not mentioning valves yet, because these instruments came around before valves. They were kind of compromise instruments, the ability to play some low notes, but they certainly weren't contrabass instruments. And those didn't come along until the valve was invented. And Adolph Sax, I guess, was the first one that used valves in a contrabass brass. Well, it was a bass brass instrument, really. And then they made some contrabass versions. And so the very first composers the famous composer you might know today that used some of these kinds of instruments, I would say, now his name is Hector Berlioz, wrote a lot for the Ophicleide. And Ben, you may know, I'm not sure if the tuba was around and he used tuba in place of Ophicleide ever.
Well, Berlioz actually, when the tubas were invented, loved them because he did think the Ophicleide was not the best.
Right.
But the Ophicleide has the fundamental sound and range of about a euphonium.
Right.
So it actually, the lowest typically made Ophicleide, historic Ophicleide, only produces a B flat 1, which is the same lowest note as a bassoon. So they could be treated as a brass instrument bassoon versus a real contrabass instrument like a contrabass tuba or saxhorn that was the first tubas. So yes, Berlioz loved it, but he had no players of the instrument at that point.
Right. So all of the stuff that was written by Berlioz, and also some things that were written by Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn wrote parts for the Ophicleide as well. All those get played by tuba today. Those parts are very interesting also because they're very similar to a bassoon part and not necessarily to what you would think of as a tuba part today. If you're used to listening to a tuba play in marches, where you play the the bass line 1-5-1-5 and then occasionally get to play a break strain. The Ophicleide under Mendelssohn and tuba under Mendelssohn and Berlioz is very different. It used what I would call as a bass tuba is what gets used today to play those Ophicleide parts. And I've got one here. Now this looks nothing like the tubas in Berlioz's time, or certainly Mendelssohn's time. The Ophicleide looks nothing like it, but it will sound. It has a very round, almost euphonium-like sound, but it's deeper than euphonium. So this is something from Berlioz's Hungarian March, just a little bit. So you get a lot of those kind of melodies when you play those early tuba parts, and they're a lot of fun. Around the time the Germans had a different idea for tuba, so oftentimes in the orchestra I have to have two instruments because if I'm playing French literature, this instrument is actually very big for the French literature, to be honest with you. Playing Mendelssohn and some of those things, I have to really play light on this instrument or I overpower. So this is my version of a bass tuba, to play light and to play the light high stuff that's required by those early early composers for the tuba. Now I'm going to put this one down. I'm going to pick up. I'm going to pick up the contrabass tuba. Now, composers like Wagner was probably the first orchestral real champion of the tuba. And Wagner wrote parts for bass tuba, but he also wrote parts for contrabass tuba. And they sound something like this. This would be from, this is actually the very beginning of, I'll just play a few notes from the very beginning of the Die Meistersinger Overture. So that is an example of something. I wish I was playing better now, but that's an example of something that would be very typical of contrabass music written of the time. This would be the 1870s, 1880s. That just kind of gives you an idea of why you may have, if you've been to see Symphony Tacoma play, you might have seen me bring two tubas to a concert, and that's why different music calls for very different sounds in different ranges.
You get a special parking spot when you have to bring two tubas?
No, I don't. If it's really bad, I'll park outside the hall, drop the horns off, and then go park. But to be honest, 20 years ago when I first started playing the orchestra, I'd walk with two horns from all over the place. I am a much more conservative now as I'm getting older. I only bring two tubas if I absolutely have to. I try and find any way that I can get away with just using one tuba now.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks very much, Paul. Keith, let me turn back to you. Tell us a little bit about the low brass in non-orchestral ensembles. Obviously, that's a big topic, but just sort of open the door for us so we can go explore more if we want to.
Sure. So for this topic, I'll leave out opera and ballet pit orchestras because that's kind of orchestral in nature as well. And I would like to focus on groups that I know are here in the Puget Sound area, just some of the different kinds of opportunities, groups that are here in our area that you can find and go out and play in. So let's see here. I guess one of the biggest groups would be wind ensembles. you frequently hear those in college, but there are a couple of wind ensembles in our area that are meant for adults. And like the Seattle Wind Ensemble and the Washington Wind Ensemble are just two of them that come to my mind. And those are great opportunities to play. They do regular concerts, and they have a full group of people attending, so you get to cover all the instruments. And they do some. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you maybe talk about the difference a little bit between playing in an orchestra section and playing trombone in the wind ensemble?
Well, there's quite a few less rests to count in wind ensemble. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
It's a different style playing, isn't it? I mean, to play an orchestra, you have to be prepared to sit down for 30 minutes, pick up your horn, and play something incredibly difficult and exposed. Whereas in band, for the most part, you were worried about running out of shape, and staying in shape and not dying before the end of the concert.
Yeah, it's a big difference. Yeah, and I haven't really played in a wind ensembles, since college days. Not very much anyway. So I kind of miss that. Another pretty good sized ensemble that we have in our area are British brass bands. And there are at least two that I know of, the Puget Brass, and then there's the Northwest Brass Band. Those are both very active British style brass bands where they don't have any woodwind instruments involved at all. It's all trumpets, cornets, all the trumpets and cornets you could possibly imagine are there, and euphoniums, trombones, tubas, it's all there. And they play some really excellent music. So British brass bands, that's a pretty good thing. Musical pit orchestras for musicals can be a super good place to find brass instruments and low brass. It used to be more like that with older musicals. You'd have, a whole section of trombones, 3 trombones, but they're kind of winnowing down the pit orchestras for musicals these days, and oftentimes you find just one trombone, and sometimes none. So that's a good place to find work and to work as a musician. Musicals. Let's see what else. You can form your own chamber groups like brass quartets or brass quintets, and there's some excellent literature out there for those. There is a pretty kind of a famous brass quartet that has a couple people that are from this area, the Westerlies. That brass quartet called the Westerlies is super good. They do this original music. They have quite a few albums out, and they have taken the brass quartet to a new level, and it's really fun to see that. Yeah. Brass quintet, that's a pretty common grouping of brass instruments. Symphony Tacoma kind of has a brass quintet that plays every now and then, and in fact, one of the most recent concerts that I did was with the Symphony Tacoma Brass Quintet. We got together in person, but spread apart, and recorded some Christmas music that was played in December. That's probably, I don't know if that's on YouTube anymore or not. But it was the most recent thing that I've done, and it was really nice because it was actually in person. Instead of recording stuff at home and then putting it together on a computer. All right. Let's see. Jazz bands are everywhere in our area. There's probably the cream of the crop is the Seattle Jazz Repertory Orchestra. They do regular concerts, and they feature famous jazz artists from out of town, and plus, of course, you get to see all the locals play too. And there's a whole bunch of neighborhood jazz bands that meet, so everybody can keep their chops up and have fun playing, like the Jazz Police, the Jim Cutler Orchestra, Roadside Attraction, I used to play in a band called the Magnolia Jazz Band. All of those groups are very busy, and they usually meet once a week. A lot of those groups just so everybody can have a chance to play. Let's see, polka bands. You can get a few gigs in September and October around the Oktoberfest time. Not so much the other parts of the year, but there's a group called the Bavarian Villagers Polka Band, and they have a huge repertoire of tunes from Europe to present, and they used to play a lot at a restaurant called the Rhine House, but nothing like that has been happening for at least a year or so. Maybe in the future. Mexican bands. There's a lot of Mexican bands in our area. There's ranchero bands like Banda Vagos, and those like feature big trumpet sections, clarinets, trombones, not so and tuba. The tuba parts are just virtuosic in those groups. If you go listen to a ranchero band, you will hear some amazing tuba players. They also have salsa bands, which are I don't know of any particular salsa bands in our area, but I know there's a lot of them, and you can hear those like in bars, restaurants, and bars and stuff like that. And there's also a group called La Banda Gazona that specializes in folk music from Oaxaca, and so there's the good opportunities to play in Mexican bands around here. Let's see, horn bands like rock bands. There's some rock bands that use horns, but I don't know much about those. Cambalacha, I think, was a big one. There's a good opportunity for work there. There's a group called Seattle Rock Orchestra that has strings and woodwinds and brass and percussion, and they produce their own special arrangements for rock bands. Like they might do a concert that features music of the Beatles, for example. There's street bands. There's a band called the Anti-Fascist Marching Band, and they get together for protests, things, and you can use your musical talents to entertain protesters. Just stay out of the way of the police and the horses, and you'll be okay.
That's absolutely great. That's such an amazing list. I suppose one nice thing about the brass instruments is that if it rains, it's not as bad as if you're holding a violin, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, the trombone is probably one of the only instruments you can hop in the shower with.
Listen, gentlemen, we're out of time. I'd like to bring this to a close. I do want to ask, several people have wondered whether maybe, Grant, were you holding an alto trombone, and would you play us a couple of notes on it just to take us out?
Sure. Yeah, I'll grab my alto trombone. And, in modern usage, it's the smallest trombone that we normally ever use. And, I know Ben was saying that back, if we're being historically accurate, back in Mozart's time and so in Beethoven's time, they actually used 3 tenors, which is actually news to me. But nowadays, we've decided to start playing the first trombone parts on music from that period on this alto trombone, which is pitched in a bit smaller than your normal tenor trombone. And the alto trombone is pitched in E flat usually, at least the modern ones that they make. And like I said, it's used to play the first trombone part, which is sometimes in the music labeled as the alto part, so alto trombone. And not only does it make those parts easier to play because they're written pretty high up there in the register, which makes them pretty hard to play on, sometimes pretty hard to play on the tenor trombone, but it also, it gets a different sound quality, which it's a special sound quality that I think fits music from that period. It's not quite as loud as, you know, a tenor trombone, and that music doesn't really need to be quite as loud. It's from an earlier era in classical music. But anyway, here's just a demonstration of what the alto trombone sounds like. Kind of low on it sometimes, but it's usually best for playing those higher parts.
Oh, and to be clear, the alto trombone didn't die out, but in Vienna during Mozart's time, it was typical to use 3 tenors, and in much of France too. But there are examples, as I stated earlier, of alto trombones being produced throughout the 19th century and bass trombones, but the typical day-to-day stuff in Vienna and in later parts in the 19th century in France was to use 3 tenors.
Yeah.
And Berlioz actually specified he loved the sound of the alto trombone on the first trombone parts that he wrote.
Yeah.
So the Symphonie Fantastique, which has an alto trombone part, would have been played on, he would have specified that. But that's just performance practice versus what was there. Brahms specified 3 different length instruments in his symphonies. However, some of them are very difficult to play on an F bass trombone. So there's no general reason to do it with modern orchestras.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, members of the low brass section. From the back row, we have Keith Winkle, Grant Reed, Ben Hansen, and Paul Evans. It's just been absolutely delightful to enter your worlds. I think one of the things that we discover when we talk with you is just how deep the worlds of every single instrument on the stage are, right? The history, the evolution of the instruments, and then, of course, all the playing techniques that you have developed in order to play the music that crazy people like me, the composer, comes up with. And so it's just delightful to really enter your worlds for an evening and to hear you speak so eloquently and so passionately about your instruments. Once again, let me thank our sponsors for this evening: Multicare, Tacoma Creates, the Washington State Arts Commission, Saturna Capital, and Titus Will. Thank you all very much, audience, for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Keep your eye on the Symphony Tacoma upcoming events webpage, and we will see you again very shortly. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye.